On December 31st, 1999, in Del Rio, Texas, 10-year-old Crystal Surlees was spending the night at her friend 13-year-old Kayleen Harris's house. Suddenly, Crystal woke up to the sound of a scream. Lying on the top bunk, she saw a stranger standing in the room. The man was large, with a mop of unkempt hair and piercing dark eyes. In his hand, he held a knife. Frozen in fear, Crystal watched as the man stabbed her friend multiple times before slashing her throat. Crystal clutched her own neck and tried to stay perfectly still. The intruder seemed so focused on what he was doing that he didn't notice her. Then he moved toward the bedroom door. Placing one hand on the doorknob and the other on the light switch, he paused and turned back, scanning the room. Crystal held her breath, but the man noticed the glint in her wide-open eyes, fixed unblinkingly on him. He took his hand off the doorknob and stepped back into the room toward Crystal. Moments later, he calmly left the room, leaving his two victims bleeding out. If Tommy Lynn Sells' entire life could be summed up in one word, it would be instability. From the earliest moments of his childhood, he learned that nothing was permanent. Not family, not friendships, and certainly not a stable home. At just 18 months old, Tommy faced a devastating blow. His twin sister contracted spinal meningitis. It's possible that Tommy was also infected, and the illness may have been a contributing factor to his future behavior. While he was too young for a definitive diagnosis, it's known that this disease can cause severe brain damage. Tommy's sister died from the infection, but he survived. Shortly afterward, his mother sent him to live with his aunt. Tommy lived happily with his aunt until he was 5 years old, and she even wanted to become his legal guardian. However, when his mother learned of this, she took him back. From that moment, Tommy's life began a steep decline. In his mother's small home, there was little space for books and even less for a child's toys. Tommy stopped attending school and began wandering aimlessly through the streets. During one of these wanderings, 8-year-old Tommy met Frank Jones, a predator who preyed on the boy's trust. Frank lured Tommy with gifts, which came at a horrifying cost. Tommy's mother knew he was spending time with an older man, but either couldn't or wouldn't protect her son. Eventually, Tommy stopped going to school altogether. His behavior became so unruly that even his own mother feared him. One morning when Tommy returned from Frank's house, he discovered that his family had packed up their belongings and left without him. At such a young age, too young even to get a job or a driver's license, Tommy was completely alone. Gathering what few possessions he had, including a gun of unknown origin, he left town, hitchhiking from place to place. Unknowingly, he was embarking on a life filled with alcohol, violence, and murder. By the time he was 15, he was accustomed to living as a drifter, traveling across the country and fantasizing about exacting revenge on his abuser, Frank, though he did nothing about it. For now, one summer night in 1979, Tommy broke into a small house in Mississippi looking for beer. Once inside the bedroom, he saw a middle-aged couple, John and Caitlin Cade, sleeping peacefully. Tommy had entered the house just to steal something, but the thrill of the theft quickly gave way to rage. Something about John's face reminded him of Frank. The memories stirred a dormant anger within him. He pulled out a gun, shot the sleeping man, and fled. John woke up in pain and shock. He stumbled into the bathroom to wash the blood off his hands, where he collapsed and bled out before the ambulance arrived. In desperation, Caitlin called the police and searched the house for the intruder, but Tommy had long since disappeared into the night. After this incident, the teenager replayed the crime in his mind over and over. He thought about how easy it was, how fast it happened. His rage and despair turned into pure adrenaline. It would take several more years for Tommy to fully realize that he was as addicted to killing as he was to alcohol and drugs, but the thrill of murder was unlike anything else. Over the next 13 years, he traveled across the country, working as a mechanic or a laborer at amusement parks, spending his free time raping and killing people. If the police caught him, it was only for offenses like drinking or stealing cars. In May 1992, Tommy found himself in Charleston, West Virginia. For 14 years, he had lived without a family or home, never staying in one place for more than a month. Wherever he went, he was a stranger. Unlike his name, however, his heinous deeds were becoming known. Unfortunately, the police hadn't connected his crimes yet, partly because he had no fixed modus operandi. He used whatever weapon was available and targeted men, women, children, and even entire families. Tommy was unlike a typical criminal. He genuinely enjoyed taking lives. Despite his brutality, he had never been arrested for murder. In the early 1990s, Tommy's mental health, which had always been unstable, grew more erratic as he began to worry that one of his victims might fight back. That fear became a reality in 1992 when he met his match, a 20-year-old woman named Fabienne Witherspoon. By 1992, Tommy had devised a new method to lure victims. He stood by the roadside holding a sign that read, "Hungry, will work for food." Many people tossed him spare change, which he spent on drugs or a motel room. But money wasn't what he was after. He was hunting for something very specific, a kind-hearted young woman who was compassionate enough to invite him home for a meal. Fabienne Witherspoon fit that description perfectly. She was too kind to ignore someone in need of help. When she saw the frail, pitiful man, she offered to take him home, promising to pack him some food. Tommy eagerly agreed. When they arrived at her home, Fabienne grabbed 2 large bags and began filling them with groceries. Tommy stood by the door, watching her movements and planning his attack. After she had finished packing the food, she asked Tommy if he or his family needed anything else. He replied that his wife could use some clothes. Too generous to say no, Fabienne went to her bedroom to pick out some shirts for Tommy's fictitious wife. Alone by the front door, Tommy saw his long-awaited opportunity. While Fabienne rummaged through the closet, he slipped into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and crept up behind her. Sensing his breath on her neck, Fabienne slowly turned around and looked at Tommy. He no longer appeared to be the sad, helpless man she had picked up on the roadside. He now stood with her knife pointed directly at her. Tommy ordered Fabienne to undress. She hesitated, but he pressed the blade to her neck, reminding her that she had no choice. After she disrobed, he led her to the bathroom where he sexually assaulted her. During the attack, however, Fabienne managed to suppress her fear and disgust. She focused on one thing: survival. As she discreetly scanned the room, she looked for something she could use as a weapon. Within arm's reach stood a ceramic duck. Fabienne grabbed it and smashed it against Tommy's head. Caught off guard by the blow and the flying shards, Tommy staggered backward. Before he could react, Fabienne began stabbing him with the sharp fragments of the figurine. She snatched the knife from his hand and bolted for the front door, hoping to escape and call for help. But Tommy intercepted her, dragging her back into the bathroom. Fabienne was not an aggressive person, but Tommy left her no choice. With all the strength she could muster, she stabbed him with the knife. She continued striking him wherever she could, yet Tommy seemed almost impervious to her blows. He eventually overpowered her, took the knife, and tied her up using duct tape and shredded bedsheets. While she struggled to free herself, he grabbed a small stool and beat her until she lost consciousness. Before fleeing, Tommy made a shallow cut across her neck, leaving her for dead. Fabienne regained consciousness hours later. Memories of the assault flooded her mind, and she panicked, unsure if her attacker was still in the house. Struggling free from her restraints, she grabbed a phone and ran out of the house, leaving a trail of blood behind her. Once outside, she called the police. Despite Tommy's lies about having a family and children, he had given Fabienne his real name. Officers quickly located the apartment where he was staying with yet another girlfriend. Seriously injured and writhing in pain, Tommy was taken to the hospital. During the struggle, adrenaline had dulled the pain of Fabienne's attacks. But as he recovered, he realized just how close she had come to killing him. She had seemed so kind, so weak, so defenseless, yet she had left him bedridden. Lying in the hospital bed, staring at the IV in his arm, Tommy made himself a promise. He would never again risk his own safety. From that moment on, he vowed to target only those victims who would be completely incapable of fighting back. He would prey only on children. After recovering, Tommy accepted a plea deal. He served 5 years in prison for the assault on Fabienne, but when he was released, he was angrier than ever before. By 1999, his addiction had reached unimaginable proportions. No matter how many crimes he committed, it was never enough. Finally, he arrived in Del Rio, Texas, where he hoped to quench his insatiable thirst for blood. Tommy spent 6 months in the state looking for the perfect victim. He didn't want his next murder to be random like the previous ones. He wanted it to be deliberate, planned, and very brutal. For this, it was important to him that people trusted him, and as he had recently discovered, the best way to achieve this was by attending church. It was there that he met Terry and Crystal Harris and their 13-year-old daughter, Kayleen, whom everyone simply called Katie. Upon seeing the girl, he realized that she was the one he needed. Tommy tried to find out everything he could about the family. He discovered that in December, the Harrises would help their friend Pam Searles move from Kansas, and Pam and her daughter would stay with Terry and Crystal during the move. More importantly, he learned that on December 30th, Terry would travel to Kansas to help Pam pack, which meant that his wife would be home with the children that night. Tommy saw a perfect opportunity to mark the new year. The evening before the attack, he spent his time in a familiar place, the bar. Leaving around 2 a.m., he headed straight for the Harris home. Murder had become second nature to him, to such an extent that even after drinking, he moved calmly and confidently. Tommy approached the house, opened a window, and climbed inside. He moved from room to room until he found Katie sleeping. Tommy slipped onto the bottom bunk of the bunk bed where the girl slept. In his hand, he held a large knife, which he used to cut Katie's clothes. She woke up, but before she could say anything, the man covered her mouth with his other hand. He tried to assault her, but the girl screamed and jumped out of bed. She tried to escape, but Tommy easily grabbed her and stabbed her, letting her body fall to the floor. After delivering a series of blows, he slashed her throat and was about to leave when he saw the girl on the upper bunk staring at him. Without hesitation, he moved toward her. The poor girl clutched her throat in terror. The man ordered her to lower her hands, and when she obeyed, he drew the knife across her neck. Then Tommy ran out of the room, not forgetting to wipe the doorknob to avoid leaving fingerprints. Bleeding profusely, 10-year-old Crystal Searles lay there, thinking about the other members of Katie's family and her own sisters sleeping in the nearby rooms. Had the man attacked them too? Were they still alive? Crystal forced herself to rise. Holding her neck with one hand, she crawled over to Katie, who was lying on the floor. She was making wheezing sounds. Crystal wanted to comfort her friend, to tell her everything would be okay, but realized she couldn't utter a word. Unable to speak, Crystal simply lay beside Katie and stroked her back. Soon, Katie went silent, and Crystal understood that Katie was gone. But at that very moment, she heard a voice telling her, "Don't lie here. Get up. Come on. Go, go." Later, Crystal would admit that it was Katie who had helped her that night, as if her soul was guiding her on what to do. Crystal was undoubtedly afraid to stay in the house. What if the man was still inside? But she understood that she needed to call for help, so she went outside and saw a light in the distance. Katie's family lived in a very remote area, surrounded by nothing but desert. Luckily, another house was nearby, and Crystal hurried toward it. She banged on the doors. The startled homeowner asked who was there, but Crystal couldn't answer. She desperately kept knocking. Thankfully, the residents decided to open the door. They contacted emergency services, and Crystal, still bleeding, wrote notes to explain everything. She wrote 3 lines. "The Harrises are hurt. Please tell them to hurry. I need help for my neck. Will I survive?" Crystal was airlifted to a hospital in San Antonio. Miraculously, doctors were able to save her life and restore her ability to speak. After the surgery, Crystal woke up weak but with a sharp memory of what had happened. The first thing she asked was whether Katie was okay, although she likely already knew the answer. Then she described the attacker to the officers and helped create a composite sketch. Katie's mother recognized the face. It was that of their new acquaintance, Lynn Sells. When Tommy's picture was shown to Crystal among photos of other men, she confirmed that he was the one who had attacked her and her friend. At 5:30 a.m. on January 2nd, officers stood on the doorstep of Tommy's house. The door was unlocked, so they went inside. The expression on the man's face showed neither surprise nor indignation. He simply said, "I'm glad I finally got caught. I'm tired of doing this." During a search of the area around Tommy's house, the police found a knife approximately 30 centimeters long. This grotesque weapon was clearly Tommy's favorite, as it had been sharpened so often that the blade had become incredibly thin. The man didn't try to deny anything. On the contrary, he willingly talked about the crime and even agreed to a reconstruction of the events. He led the officers through the rooms, pointing out the various bedrooms in the Harris home and describing where everyone had slept that night. He explained that he hadn't touched the other members of the household because he came for Katie specifically. Perhaps the large number of people in the house made him wary of fully carrying out his violent plans, which is why he killed only Katie. During the reconstruction, the officers likely began to realize they were dealing with a dangerous individual. However, they had yet to uncover the full scale of his crimes. In the car, as they were returning to the station, Tommy leaned toward the investigator and whispered, "I think you want to know about the others." Tommy revealed that over 20 years, he had brutally killed more than 70 people. Some of the attacks were so spontaneous and random that he didn't even know the names of his victims. Often his crimes remained unsolved, or innocent people were wrongly convicted for them. For instance, he confessed to the infamous 1982 murder of a woman and the attack on her young daughters in St. Louis. In 1982, Melissa DeBoer was 7 years old. She lived with her mother, Joanne Tate, and younger sister, Renee. On that April night, Melissa awoke to an unfamiliar noise. She didn't understand why there was a naked man standing before her, or why her mother was lying motionless on the floor. When she asked what was happening, the man said her mother was asleep. He then pulled Melissa out of bed, carried her to her mother's room, laid her on the bed, and began undressing her. However, Melissa fought back desperately and bit him. Enraged, the man pushed her away, and she noticed something glinting in the darkness. It was a knife, which he didn't hesitate to use. Afterward, he went to the kitchen to wash the blood off the knife. Barely alive, Melissa knew she needed to hide and crawled under her sister's bed. From there, she was forced to watch as the man sat in the room, lit a cigarette, and turned on the television until she lost consciousness. Hours later, Melissa, her gravely injured sister, and their deceased mother were found by Melissa's uncle and her mother's boyfriend. Despite their horrific injuries, Melissa and Renee survived, but Joanne was killed. For this crime, Joanne's ex-boyfriend, Rodney Lincoln, was sentenced to life in prison. The conviction relied solely on the testimony of 7-year-old Melissa and a hair that police claimed belonged to Lincoln. In 2010, advanced DNA testing revealed the hair did not belong to Lincoln. In 2015, Melissa saw a photograph of Lynn Sells, and she was struck by a wave of memories. She realized she had been blaming the wrong man all these years. The true killer was Lynn Sells. Melissa refused to remain silent. She went to the police and recanted her testimony, leading to Rodney's release in 2018 after 36 years of wrongful imprisonment. Another high-profile case linked to Tommy is that of Julie Rhea and her 10-year-old son, Joel Kirkpatrick. On the night of October 13, 1997, under the cover of darkness, the predator entered their home and stabbed young Joel to death. Awoken by her son's horrific screams, Julie confronted the killer. They struggled, but the stranger escaped. Julie was devastated and overwhelmed with grief, but she wasn't given the chance to mourn in peace. Despite injuries she could not have inflicted on herself, she was accused of Joel's murder. False accusations from her ex-husband, inadequate forensic technology, and a prosecutor blinded by ambition to secure a conviction all led to Julie being sentenced to 65 years in prison. After Lynn Sells was arrested, he confessed to the crime. Julie was exonerated in 2006, but the prosecutor refused to reopen Joel's case, denying him official justice. The trial of Lynn Sells began 9 months after the murder of Katie Harris, with 11-year-old Crystal Searles as the prosecution's key witness. While law enforcement was investigating Sells' confessions to other crimes, the immediate focus was to secure a conviction for Katie's murder and the attack on Crystal. If found guilty, Sells faced either life imprisonment or the death penalty. By the time of the trial, Crystal had physically recovered from the deep wound to her neck and was prepared to testify, determined to seek justice for Katie. Crystal made her mother promise not to cry in court, fearing it might make her break down as well. That day, Crystal saw Sells for the first time since the attack. Walking past her attacker with confidence, she ascended the witness stand, but nerves initially got the better of her. After a brief pause to compose herself, she delivered her testimony with remarkable clarity and courage. Pointing directly at Sells, she detailed the horrific events of that night. At one point, to help the jury visualize what had happened, she lay down on a table and demonstrated how Sells had slashed her throat. Her testimony was so powerful that even Sells' defense attorney struggled to maintain composure. When his turn came to cross-examine Crystal, he simply smiled, praised her bravery, and stated that he had no questions for her. The jury deliberated for only an hour and 10 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Sells' guilt was indisputable, and even his attorney focused solely on sparing him from the death penalty. On September 18, 2000, Lynn Sells was convicted of Katie's murder and the attempted murder of Crystal Searles. After further deliberation, the jury recommended the death penalty. Crystal later admitted that, initially, she wanted this outcome, but over time, her feelings changed. She struggled with the idea of wishing death upon another person, even someone like Sells. Through his confessions and corroborated evidence, investigators linked Sells to at least 22 murders, with credible connections to another 15 cases across the country. However, due to Texas laws, prisoners sentenced to death cannot be extradited to face trial in other states. On April 3, 2014, Lynn Sells was executed. When offered the chance to make a final statement, he declined. Despite his silence in his final moments, Lynn Sells left a legacy of pain and terror. For over 2 decades, he evaded justice, his transient lifestyle enabling him to commit heinous acts and disappear like a phantom. This rootlessness, shaped by his chaotic upbringing, became his greatest weapon. Yet for his victims and their families, Sells remains an unshakable memory, a symbol of unimaginable evil and the devastating toll it exacts.